Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We welcome you to this Elder Justice Initiative webinar on forensic research. As with all technology, we may at some time experience a momentary lapse in the webinar session. In the event that would happen, please be patient, remain with us. The webinar should resume shortly. We do want to take a moment to see that everyone is connected. Today's audio is being played through your computer only, so we want to make sure that you have your speakers on or your headphones connected. If you are experiencing any technical problems, please send a private chat message to the technical specialist, Jason. You can do that through the chat feature. If you cannot access the chat or the web portion of this webinar, we ask you to send Jason an email at jadams@ovcttac.org. If you have questions throughout today's webinar, you can type them in the feedback or the chat box found on your lower right. We will take time at the end of the webinar today to address pertinent questions and also to check in and make sure that everyone has information for follow-up questions should we not get to your question today. And finally, I want to note that today's session is being recorded. It will be made available on our OVC-TTAC training website following the webinar. Today's webinar is entitled Neural Correlates of Financial Decision-Making in Old Age, featuring Dr. Buchel. So at this time, I'm going to turn things over to our first speaker, Dr. Sid Stahl. He's a research consultant at the U.S. Department of Justice. Sid.
Thank you, Lori. Today's webinar is part of the Department of Justice's Elder Justice Initiative. The mission of that initiative is to support and coordinate the Department of Justice's enforcement and programmatic efforts to combat elder abuse, neglect, and financial fraud and scams that tend to target older individuals. The initiative does this and meets this mission by promoting justice for older adults, helping older victims and their families, enhancing state and local efforts through training resources, and most germane to today's webinar is supporting, organizing, and presenting research to improve elder abuse policy and practice. The webinars are part of the initiative, but one of the main projects of the initiative is a very extensive elder justice website. The address is up there on the screen, elderjustice.gov, and we invite you, as time permits, to visit that website. I'd like now to introduce, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. S. Buchel, who will be presenting the materials on today's webinar. Dr. Hahn is a diplomate of the American Board of Professional Psychology in Clinical Neuropsychology. He is Director of Neuropsychology in the Department of Family Medicine and Associate Professor of Family Medicine, Neurology, Psychology, and Gerontology at the Keck School of Medicine at the University of Southern California. Dr. Hahn's research involves factors that impact cognition and financial decision-making in aging, and on using neuroimaging and statistical approaches to understand these factors. He maintains an active research relationship with the Rush University and Chicago's Rush University's Alzheimer's Disease Center. Dr. Hahn is widely published and is the recipient of prestigious and very coveted Beeson Award from the National Institute on Aging at NIH, in addition to several other national and international awards and honors. We are pleased and honored to have Dr. S. Buchel with us today. Duke, yours.
Okay, thank you for that very nice introduction, Sid. And thank you to the Elder Justice Initiative and the Department of Justice. I'm very honored to be sharing with you and speaking with you about some research I've been doing with various smart people at the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center over the last few years now. And since I'm going to be talking about the brain, I want to start with one of my favorite cartoons about the brain. And for those of you that can't read this, I'll read this for you. It says, I figured out what was wrong with my brain. On the left hemisphere, there's nothing right, and on the right hemisphere, there's nothing left. And so this is often how I feel. Sometimes when I'm trying to understand this very complex construct we're calling financial decision-making or decision-making in the context of aging, it's a very complex thing to try to understand. And so I'll be talking about a few studies that we've done to try to understand this, mostly from a brain perspective. So in terms of background, adults over the age of 65 hold about a third of the U.S. household wealth, and this is probably a larger portion because this particular fact is a few years old now, and we know that the number of older adults is increasing in our nation. Older adults, however, lose more than $3 billion annually to financial scams or fraud, and some estimate this to be as high as $36 billion. So it's probably somewhere in between those two figures. And the problem of this financial and healthcare fraud targeted at elderly persons is so significant that the FBI maintains a website dedicated to the problem. And I just want to take a brief moment to just show what this looks like on the FBI website. So in addition to this, the New York Times came up with an interesting article a number of years ago showing that changes in financial handling or financial decision-making might be one of the earliest signs of impending Alzheimer's disease. And so this was something that a number of people have actually found as a compelling potential new fact. And a lot of this work has been spearheaded by my colleague Patricia Buchel. Dr. Patricia Buchel is a full professor at the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center. And she published a paper that I think directly speaks to this belief. And in this paper that I'm showing right now, she showed that poor decision-making is a consequence of cognitive decline among older persons without Alzheimer's disease or mild cognitive impairment. So these are older adults that don't have any real noticeable signs of cognitive impairment, but they're showing cognitive decline. And it seems like poor decision-making is associated with that in, again, normally functioning or seemingly normally functioning older adults. Now, we also know this is an important topic to try to understand because as a number of us who are watching or are familiar with elder abuse work, elder abuse is associated with a number of really poor health outcomes, and this is a paper from my colleague Mark Lax, who's the head of geriatrics at Cornell, showing that mortality is associated with elder mistreatment. And we know that financial abuse of older adults is one of the most common forms of elder mistreatment. So following up on this, again, my colleague Patricia Buchel showed that poor decision-making is associated with an increased risk of mortality among older adults. And so it's arguable this is a very serious health outcome, if not one of the most serious. And so if an older adult shows impaired financial decision-making or becomes a victim of a scam, the burden is often displaced among family members, caregivers, or the community or society. There's some suggestion of this being an early sign of Alzheimer's disease. Poor decision-making is associated with increased risk of mortality. So understanding this is an important topic to try to address. But the problem is, how can we understand this? It's such a complex topic, and hopefully this is something that you'll appreciate in the context of my talk. One way we can try to understand this is using what's called a neuroeconomic approach. And so neuroeconomics is an integration of the fields of economics and neuroscience, where neuroscience methods are used to elucidate biological mechanisms of economic principles. And so this approach usually includes brain imaging or computational neuroscience methods to try to understand how people behave in an economic or financial decision-making manner. And so this became the theoretical basis for this Beeson Career Development Award, which was mentioned during my introduction. And I've been on this award for the last number of years now, and I just need to acknowledge the many people that are behind this award, in particular my colleagues at Rush. Really, this award could not have happened without their work spearheading all of this. And in particular, I need to acknowledge the National Institute on Aging's support of two large studies that are actually the foundation of a lot of the studies that I'm going to be talking about today. The first being the Rush Memory and Aging Project, which is a large longitudinal study of aging around the Chicago area. And this has a number of people that are annually followed with cognitive screens and other sorts of measurements. And then Patricia Buchel started the Decision-Making Study, which is really the foundation of a lot of the work I've done over the last 5 years. And so that study, the support of that needs to be acknowledged, and it really is the leading into a number of the studies that I'm going to be talking about today. When we first started talking about this topic a number of years ago, we thought about decision making as really being comprised of two major considerations, so cognitive factors and then affective factors or emotional processes. And really that emotional processes might have an impact on cognitive factors, and that might produce impaired decision making. And so using that as a basis, and a number of the measures that Patricia Buchel has been collecting over the years, which are listed on the left side of this slide here, including cognitive factors, affective factors, personality styles, really a whole wealth of data here, and in particular some measures on behavioral economics. And so this equation here that I'm pointing to, just to give you an appreciation of this, the complexity of this approach, is that this equation measures financial risk aversion from a behavioral economics point of view. And I'll be the first to acknowledge that I have no clue really what this equation means. However, with this equation, we can get some values, and those values we could then relate to neuroimaging outcomes here on the right. And this is the work that I've been doing over the last few years with the faculty from the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center to try to understand what's happening in the brain when we're considering decision making, and in particular financial decision making. So it needs to be said that when we first started this work, we were told that it would be important to try to understand what's happening in the aging brain. And so in talking with Randy Buckner at Harvard, he suggested trying to do this before we really started doing any specific studies. And so we know that as we get older, there are these regions of the brain, these very specific regions that seem to accumulate age-related neuropathology. So we're talking about amyloid plaque and tangopathology here. And then that neuropathology can then have an impact in the worst form of Alzheimer's disease here on specific brain regions. And so knowing that there are these specific regions that seem to be susceptible to age-related neuropathology, we came up with this idea that what happens in the context of aging might be a disconnection syndrome, so that these specific brain regions, as they become hit with neuropathology, might become disconnected from other brain regions that are important in decision-making. And so this is our theoretical model that we've been trying to look at in different ways using a few different approaches. And so what I'm going to do next is show some of the studies that we've been working on and have published over the last few years. And the first one I'm going to talk about is this risk aversion or financial risk aversion study that we did. This is one of the first studies that we did. And using that really complex equation that I showed before, what we were able to do was to look at older adults who were high in financial risk aversion and low in financial risk aversion. And just to give you a flavor for some of the measures that were included here, some of the questions were, would you prefer $15 for sure, or coin toss in which you get a certain amount greater than 15 if you flip heads, or nothing if you flip tails. And so you can see that these items had a bit of a risk associated with them, and this is a common question that's used in behavioral economics research. And what you can do is then vary the amounts here, and then look at other different aspects of this risk aversion metric. And so we wanted to see if there were these differences in the brain that could be seen for people who were high in financial risk aversion and low in financial risk aversion. And what we saw were that there were differences. So you can see that the people who were high in financial risk aversion really had these regions in the lower frontal part of their brain more functionally connected. And then people who were low in financial risk aversion had these regions in the more dorsolateral frontal part of their brain connected. And so what we saw here were functional brain differences according to financial risk aversion. And this was encouraging to see because this was consistent with a lot of work that had been done in younger populations. Up until this point, not many people had the ability to look at this in older adults. And so this was one of the first studies I believe, that looked at this in older adults. So we then looked at a behavioral economics premise called temporal discounting. And temporal discounting refers to the tendency to discount a larger reward offered at a later time for a more immediate reward offered now. And so an example of this is, say you have the option of either collecting $20 a week from now or $10 right now. If
Mute off.
you wait the week and collect the $20 because it's a lot more than $10, but some people might be a bit more impulsive or just more immediate driven, and so they might select that $10 more immediate reward now, which would be arguably a sign of poor financial decision making. And so using this approach, we looked at the range of temporal discounting, and what you can do is vary these questions so you look at a different range of response. And we looked at this in 123 non-demented older adults, and we found functional connectivity differences again by temporal discounting, and this is using again the whole range of response instead of just a two-group comparison. We looked at the range from high to low temporal discounting here. And I think one of the important findings from this work is that we found that the low temporal discounting, so the better option, was associated with greater functional connectivity of this region here in the right parahippocampal gyrus. And why that's important is because that is a region of the brain that's very implicated in memory networks, being able to remember appropriately or correctly. So it's tied to cognition. And it's also one of the regions that's most susceptible to this age-related neuropathology that I was talking about a little bit earlier. And so, so this was actually an interesting finding. Up until this point, not many people had made a lot of made a big deal about this region in the medial temporal lobe being important for financial decision making. However, since then, and actually a few people, unbeknownst to us, have actually said that this is an important region of the brain that should be considered for decision making. And so this is one example here. From Peters and Buchel from Europe, and they actually argue that it is important to consider these specific brain regions in financial decision making. And so our study was one of the first to look at this in older adults, and I think for that reason it was an interesting study at the time. So we've also been interested in factors that might support financial decision making. So in other words, might be something that you can intervene on and actually help buffer financial decision making. And so one such factor is this term financial literacy, or this concept of financial literacy. And we use this term to refer to domain-specific knowledge in financial matters. And so this is specific literacy in financial matters is what we're talking about. And we found that when we looked at this in 139 non-demented older adults, that this was associated with greater functional connectivity between the posterior cingulate and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And so these regions here are actually very important in aging, and they're regions that are talked about in what we call the default mode network, which is a brain a set of regions that's implicated in early Alzheimer's disease. And so we see here, though, we see greater functional connectivity between the two hubs of this default mode network, the posterior cingulate and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, associated with financial literacy. So it's almost as if financial literacy may have a sort of a brain protective factor here. And what's interesting about these particular set of results is that this was actually over and above considering the effects of age, education, gender or sex, and what we call cognition, so global cognition. So there's really something over and above those things that seems to be associated with greater financial literacy. And so this was a nice finding to show that the importance of financial literacy in the aging brain. So since we saw such a strong effect using functional neuroimaging in that last study, we follow this up looking at diffuse and tensor imaging. So this is a different neuroimaging approach to look at white matter integrity or white matter structural connections in the brain. And so we looked at the association of financial literacy with 346 non-demented older adults. And you can see the mean ages here in the sample. And we again found that there was greater white matter integrity in these regions throughout the brain, and in particular on the right side of the brain. And the reason why this looks like it's on the left side is because this is radiologic view, and radiologic view left is right. So the two sides are flipped here. But we see on the right side of the brain greater microstructure, white matter microstructure integrity associated with financial literacy. And again, this was after considering age, education, sex, and global cognition. So there really does seem to be something potentially protective about financial literacy, or at least beneficial about financial literacy when looking at the brain. I think one of the most relevant studies to this topic that we're talking about is this study here. We were interested in, obviously, susceptibility to scams, which is a major problem as we age. And we use a neuroimaging technique called voxel-based morphometry. And so this technique lets you look at the gray matter density in the brain at the voxel level. And so we looked at 348 non-demented older adults, and we used a measure developed by Patricia Buchel that assesses susceptibility to scams. And so these are the items here. And so I'll just read the first item as an example. The first item is, I answer the phone whenever it rings, even if I do not know who is calling. So you can imagine if someone answers affirmatively to this item, they might be more susceptible to scams. And so as I understand it, this measure was developed in reference to some work that was done by the AARP and the FINRA organization. And so these items here became a measure of susceptibility to scams that we looked at. And when we use this voxel-based morphometry approach, we found that there is this brain region that shows less gray matter density, again in the right hippocampal, parahippocampal gyrus, that's associated with greater susceptibility to scams. And so you can see that these are all of the data points here, and you can see the direction of the association as susceptibility to scams increases, the gray matter decreases. And so it really seems to point to less gray matter in this very specific brain region that might be associated with susceptibility to scams. And so I think this was a striking finding for us when we saw this. Truth be told, I wasn't expecting to see anything, but this was a pretty striking finding, and so we were able to publish and get that into the scientific literature. So I'll take a somewhat of a brief step back and point to this trend that we're starting to see using multiple different neuroimaging techniques where it looks like for some reason in the right temporal regions of the brain, we're finding a number of different results. And so I don't really have anything specific to say at this point, other than to say that using multiple different neuroimaging techniques, we seem to find that the right temporal lobe is maybe important for financial decision making in old age. This is very preliminary, but I just wanted to share this since this was a consistent finding that we were seeing across multiple studies. Okay, so I shared a lot of brain images at this point, and I really need to acknowledge the limitations here. So, this is a handful of studies that we've done using neuroimaging in an older adult cohort here. And the thing about neuroimaging is that there's a lot of variation to be acknowledged. And so these are very preliminary studies in the sense that these are some of the first studies that have looked at an older adult population and financial decision making. So these results need to be replicated at this point. I think we've had the privilege to be able to publish some of the first papers using these approaches in older adults. However, just like in any other science discovery, these need to be replicated. And so that's what these cartoons refer to. And so I also want to take another shift here at this point, that there are a number of different factors that we think enter into decision-making. I started with a rather simplistic model, and that model has gotten more complex over the years. There's cognitive factors, affective factors, contextual factors, potential environmental factors, and those all need to be acknowledged because it's a very complex topic here. So for the next few slides, I just wanted to drive in on this a little bit. One of the questions I always get is, well, if someone's having poor financial decision-making, is this really just poor cognition? And I think it can be safely said that poor cognition is really can be really associated with poor decision-making. I think most people can acknowledge it. I think most people acknowledge that if someone is demented, they're at high risk for being susceptible to scam and fraud. So we published a few studies looking at early or pre-Alzheimer's conditions. And so this is a study or an example of that, looking at a condition called mild cognitive impairment. And so mild cognitive impairment is a condition where someone is starting to have cognitive impairment, but it's not quite affecting their life that severely. And so this is considered a pre-Alzheimer's condition here. And as you might imagine, MCI, or mild cognitive impairment, is associated with worse decision-making and financial decision-making. And so this is a study looking at this, using a multiple regression approach, adjusting for the impact of age, education, and sex. And then we also looked at different aspects of cognition here, and you can see the significant associations. There are specific types of cognitive impairment that might be associated with poor decision-making, such as semantic memory, episodic memory, perceptual speed in particular. And so it is, I think, pretty clear that if someone has cognitive impairment, they might be susceptible to poor decision-making in old age. Carrying this further, we looked at mild cognitive impairment and susceptibility to scams in old age. And again, susceptibility to scams is associated with mild cognitive impairment. And so this, I think, in some ways, may not be a surprise. And so we demonstrated that here with this study. And then we also looked at financial literacy, or literacy in general, financial and health literacy in this particular study. And we found again that MCI is associated with worse literacy after adjusting for these important demographic factors. Now what's interesting here is that we found an interaction effect for financial literacy with education. And so what this points to is the fact that education may lessen the impact or the decrease in financial literacy in the context of MCI. And so this points to the importance of education being, again, a protective factor when it comes to literacy, at least. However, one of the things I've been struck with in my own work as a neuropsychologist is I started getting referred patients because it was discovered they were giving away large sums of money to a random acquaintance by their family members. And so the family members expected that this was a sign of early Alzheimer's disease, and so they would bring them in for a full cognitive assessment, which is what I do clinically. However, I had case after case, back to back, where we would give them hours of cognitive testing and they would be just fine. They would be not impaired at all. However, there was this change in financial decision-making that was happening where they were clearly just giving away money and it just didn't make sense. It was a clear change in their decision-making ability. And so I wanted to look at this in a more systematic, experimental way using this great data set from the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center. And we looked at what we are called discrepancies between cognitive ability and decision-making ability in older adults. And so we looked at 648 non-demented older adults. And we used a statistical approach where we could look in how many cases their cognitive abilities were within the range of their decision-making abilities, and in which cases they showed a significant discrepancy between their cognitive abilities and their decision-making abilities. And so this next picture I'm going to show you here, the persons in blue are the ones that show their cognitive abilities within the range of their decision-making abilities. And this is the majority of the sample, and you can see that here. However, there was quite a bit of this over 600-person sample that showed a significant discrepancy between their decision-making ability and their cognitive ability, and those are all the items in, or the persons in red and the persons in green here. And if you add these two groups up, it's about a quarter to a third of the sample. And so what this tells us is that in a normal, not non-demented sample, large sample of older adults, there are a certain number, quite a bit, about a quarter to a third of the sample that actually have a significant discrepancy between their decision-making abilities and their cognitive abilities. And this actually fits nicely with what I was seeing in clinic, where we would have these older adults coming in clearly showing a change in their decision-making abilities, but no change in their cognitive abilities or no impairment in their cognitive abilities. So we were seeing examples of this, of these discrepancy people here. So, this led to a number of different ways of thinking about this. And again, going back to my colleague Mark Lax, who's the head of geriatrics at Cornell, the first time we ever met was at a meeting, actually this annual Beeson meeting that happens. And the first time I ever met him, we started bonding about the fact that we started seeing these patients in our clinics where they were cognitively intact, but they were showing a clear change in their financial decision-making ability. And so this got us thinking that there are a number of factors, at least based on the clinical cases that we saw, that are associated with poor decision-making. And so we tried to list some of these here, some of these examples of explanations that could potentially explain this discrepancy between decision-making and cognitive ability here. And you can see clearly there could be cognitive factors, but there could be medical and functional factors and psychosocial reasons and environmental reasons. This isn't a complete list by any stretch of the imagination. This was just something that we discussed. And first time I ever met him, we had this conversation that lasted about 3 or 4 hours about this topic, just because it was so striking to us as medical professionals seeing these cases that we just couldn't really make sense out of at the time. So in summary, I have presented some studies that show that there are a complex network of brain regions involved, including the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the insula, the medial temporal regions, posterior parietal regions, that might be involved in poor decision-making in old age. I think it's important to note that although poor cognition is associated with poor decision-making, I think that's a safe bet. Poor decision-making may not be due solely to poor cognition, and I think that's an important point to keep in mind. There are likely multiple factors that are involved in poor decision-making in old age and financial decision-making in old age. And finally, I just need to highlight that these are very preliminary results, and more studies are needed to replicate or confirm these findings. Again, we've had the great privilege, and I've had the great privilege to work with some great aging researchers at the Rush Alzheimer's Center on this very complex topic. And these are preliminary results, and they need to be replicated. I think one of the questions I get is that can neuroimaging be used to, for example, identify if a person, if a specific individual might be at risk for poor financial decision-making? And I think, again, these are very preliminary studies. It's some of the first studies to look at older adults and what might be happening in the brain. So I would really caution against that use at this point. The results I presented are grouped data, so they're aggregate group data. It's not an individual set of results that I'm presenting here. And I think it'll be very many years until we get to that point. So I just wanted to make sure that was clear. And so finally, I just wanted to mention that one of the things that we're trying to do at USC is we're trying to study older adults who have been the victims of scam or fraud, more specifically using this neuroeconomic approach. So this is a pilot study that we've started over the last few months or so, and we're calling the Finance, Cognition, and Health and Elder Study. And we have some pilot funding support from the Elder Justice Foundation, and we're calling this FINCHES for short. So that's just something that we're trying to do to really take a more closer look at specific older adults who have been the victims of scam or fraud. And finally, I just need to acknowledge it takes a village to do any of this work, and in particular, the great people at the Rush Alzheimer's Center. they were a part of my mentoring team during this training grant that I've been on for the last 5 years or so, and I just need to acknowledge their great help. Also, other collaborators, Mark Lax, who I mentioned before, Randy Buckner at Harvard, Bob Willis and Ken Linga at the University of Michigan. And in particular, I need to acknowledge my chair, Laura Mosqueda, who has been a fan of this work and has supported it while I've been at USC. And that's all I have.
Thank you, Duke. If there are questions that you have for Dr. Hahn, please type them in the questions box on your screen. If there are questions or suggestions that you have for the Elder Justice Initiative, here's a website that you are welcome to type your questions to that group. So we'll wait a minute for questions showing up. Otherwise, I've got a couple of questions for Dr. Hahn. Okay. Well, let me begin. The first question that I have, Duke, you spoke in one of your slides. You spoke about a susceptibility of scams scale. I don't know who the author was, James, I think, or your colleague, Dr. Boyle. It's a five-item Likert scale. Has it been tested against people who have actually been scammed? That is, I'm asking a question, I guess, about the validity of the instrument.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. To my knowledge, I don't know the answer to that. I think Dr. Patricia Boyle is the author of that scale, and she may know. She may have actually developed that. I don't know the specific data to answer that question. That's okay, so one of the things that we're trying to do at USC is actually look and see how people perform in that scale with the older adults that we're specifically studying that have been the victims of scam or fraud. But it could be that the Rush people have that answer right away.
Okay. And has that been used on various age groups? Do you know?
So as far as I know, that it's been used just with the Rush cohort, and that cohort is a fairly older cohort. So I don't know if it has been used with other age groups.
Okay. It's interesting to me that you have married the concepts of decision-making with behavioral economics. That's a fascinating, I find that a fascinating approach. How does this concept differ from the financial capacity that has received so much attention in the literature of late?
Oh, yeah, no, I think that's a great question. So one of the things that we have done purposefully is to try to understand decision-making along a continuum. And I think that's one of the differences between our use of the term decision-making and this term financial capacity. So as I understand the term financial capacity, that is a term that's informed more from a legal perspective where someone has to achieve a certain threshold where they're considered incapacitated or not able to handle their finances. We've purposely tried to look at decision-making along a range of response just so that we can see what may change that response in terms of increasing or decreasing. So we're trying to look at the range of decision-making instead of just using a certain threshold. Now, financial capacity is something that is asked of psychologists and people who do assessments of patients all the time for legal matters. And so, but from what I understand, I don't think that there's been a very clearly defined uniform approach to defining financial capacity. There are a number of measures that are out there that people use, but as far as I know, it's still a bit of a question how you determine that. And so, that's another reason why we try to look at financial decision-making or decision-making along the range of responses, because then we can see what might change either to improve that or to show poor financial decision-making.
Thank you. I noticed that Carol Dayton has a question. You can see that? do?
Yeah, I can see that. Could the finding of good cognition but a change to risky poor decision-making indicate either the limits of the cognitive testing or the freedom of the older adult to do things they would not have done earlier in their life? And so I think that's an interesting question. So the limits of cognitive testing are always something that we have to consider. So I think it wouldn't be reasonable to acknowledge that the cognitive testing is flawless, and so that's always in consideration. The freedom of the older adult to do things they would not have done earlier in their life is a very real and important consideration. I think there should be clear autonomy when it comes to financial decision making. So there's nothing in at least my work or our work that would disagree with that sentiment at all. And it could be that an older adult is genuinely just changing their mind and how they want to use their funds. I think if that's articulated well and it makes sense, and the older adult clearly shows power in that situation, then I think it's hard to argue against that being the case, that it just being a change in the freedom of the older adult to do things like they would want. So all of that needs to be considered. I think those are important considerations when we're talking about this topic. That being said, I think we're also interested in just what seems to be, at least in a portion of older adults, a genuine change in financial decision making that doesn't seem to have any sort of explanation other than a potential susceptibility to scam or fraud, or might be associated with a cognitive decline. And so I think that's the perspective that we were taking, at least with our work.
A variable that I've seen in the literature quite a bit is the role in financial exploitation and financial capacity is the notion of numeracy. That I guess it's kind of a person's relationship with numbers, the ability to handle numbers, and the ability to use those numbers to make a decision. I think that's probably a reasonable explanation. Do you have any plans for incorporating the numeracy variable in some of your neuroimaging research?
Yeah. So from a cognitive perspective, we have a number of measures that look at numeracy. I know that Patricia Buchel has incorporated the idea of numeracy in a number of the measures that they use at Rush. And I believe it's a part of that financial literacy scale that I talked about before. So there are ways that we can look at numeracy. I think in our at least preliminary work, I don't know how much numeracy may explain some of these early changes. But again, that could be a cognitive test sensitivity issue. That's something that we need to take a closer look at. My feeling is that it's not simply just a numeracy issue, that there's something beyond that. And I think it's really this interaction of multiple brain regions that might be at play. But that's just a hypothesis at this point.
I know that brain imaging is in its brain imaging and neuroeconomics is kind of in its infancy.
Yep.
What do you think the future is for forensics? Especially in helping prosecutors with this notion. I know you're just beginning that work, and you're one of the only people in the states that I'm aware of that's doing this kind of work. What do you think the implications are for future research, or for the prosecution or the handling of financial exploitation cases?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question. And I don't come from that perspective, so I need to just acknowledge that up front. That being said, I don't think it's so clearly I don't think that the neuroimaging should be used in prosecution situations at this point. I don't think that approach has been developed to the point where it can be reliably used in a court case, for example. That's just my personal opinion at this point on the state of the field. I think, though, just like in any other developed new technology, I can't deny that this might eventually get to that point in the future. And so it could be that this work might lay the groundwork for other sorts of forensic approaches that could be used. And I guess I would imagine that as more of a multidisciplinary approach, things that might use not just neuroimaging, but also other sorts of assessment measures to really come at a conclusion. But again, it's outside of my world, so I don't want to say too much and get in trouble, if that makes any sense.
Okay. Another question that I hear frequently is that are older adults really more vulnerable than other age categories to be financially exploited or scammed? You know, besides the Willie Sutton effect, that is, you know, that's where the money is. Have your studies indicated or compared age groups at all to determine whether elders are more likely or more frequently exploited or scammed?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. I don't know if the data that I've been working with at Rush can answer that, just because the cohort, again, is a much older cohort. And I think you would need to track, you would need a large number of participants at multiple different ages to actually look at something like that. So I'm not aware of any sort of systematic data that has looked at that question. I think there's a presumption that as we get older, we might become more susceptible to scam or fraud. However, I think this is a very important point to make. I don't think just because someone is getting older, they are going to be more susceptible to scam or fraud. I think, you know, I can use the example of my father, who's a better financial decision maker than I think ever will be, and he's clearly much older than I am. So we're really talking about a portion of older adults that might be susceptible to scam or fraud. And so I think I need to make that point clear, that I don't think it's just a blanket age consideration, although age could be an important factor. And it, you know, on a broad, you know, large number of people, if someone looked at a large population, that trend might be observable. But at least at the individual level, I don't think someone can claim that, just because there's quite a bit of variation whenever you're looking at these large population studies, and so that variation needs to be acknowledged.
Okay. I have, I guess, one more question that came to mind as you were talking. As you noted in your conversation, that decision making really involves a lot more than just cognitive processes. It involves context, involves personality factors like
Yes.
impulsivity, conscientiousness, risk-taking, etc. Are there other factors that are any of these factors, or are other factors able to be imaged in your work to determine if they are at all associated with the same regions in the brain as some of the other variables that you have that you've used?
Yeah, in theory they are, absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's something that I think we could always carry this work to look at what are those more specific factors that might impact financial decision making, albeit contextual factors or you know, affective factors, emotional factors. There may be some factors that we haven't even really considered yet that might be important in this question. I think we're always on the lookout for what that could be. I think it's partly informed by our clinical work, so what we see at the patient level. But I think I really think that this is a multifactorial problem. I don't think that there's just one route to poor decision making. And I think a number of people would agree with that statement. And it's really it's going to be important to try to identify what each one of those factors is, because that way we can intervene. If there's a specific factor that might be the culprit for any one person or a group of people, if it's something that could be intervened upon to help prevent elder financial exploitation, I think that's an important consideration. And so we're always on the lookout for what those factors are.
Would it be your guess that that's some of the same regions of the brain that show up that are already showing up on some of those factors?
Yeah, and I think that could be one way that we can test it. So, for example, if we saw certain regions of the brain that are important for decision making, if there are factors that we can see that may improve some of the characteristics of that brain region from a structural or functional standpoint, it could be that we see improved financial decision making, and we're getting at a very experimental approach. or at least that's what we're talking about now, and I think that's something that we're very interested in.
Very good. Well, I'm kind of out of questions, and if there are no other questions, or anybody on the line wants to ask a question, we still have a minute or two left. I would remind you that if indeed you have questions or suggestions about the Elder Justice Initiative, that you send your questions to elder.justice at USDOJ, United States Department of Justice, .gov. And I want to thank Duke. I want to thank you very much, Dr. Hahn, for participating in this and giving us a very interesting and thought-provoking hour or so. So thank you.
Yeah,
thank you, everyone.
It's my honor, and thanks again for inviting me.
Okay, thanks, Duke. Have a good day. So long, everyone.
All right.